Hey everyone! So this video is going to be a really quick lecture about general neuroanatomy. Okay? So first, we're going to start with the brain is generally organized into three major areas. Now that's further broken down into five, but we'll just focus on the main major three. There's the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. So here you go. All of this and that little bit in the top in there, that's all the forebrain. Then the midbrain, so this top piece is still part of the forebrain, but you see this little sliver, it's a little reddish color, that is your midbrain. And then all of the rest here, this blue and this stalk right here, that's all your hindbrain. Now we're just going to go and highlight a couple features along the way. Let's first talk about your hindbrain. I want to talk about two areas in particular in your hindbrain. So here's the hindbrain. Now remember, this top piece, that's actually still part of the forebrain, and that reddish part there, that's still your midbrain. So this, and this are all your hindbrain. Now this convoluted section towards the back here, that's called the cerebellum. Now the cerebellum is primarily responsible, or traditionally thought to be primarily responsible for your vestibular sense, which is your sense of balance. And it is heavily involved. In fact, it controls, if you ever have spun around really quickly and then stopped and then saw your eyes going, that's because your ears are sending vestibular information to your cerebellum, and your cerebellum is then sending the signal to your motor cortex, specifically your occipitomotor cortex, the part of your brain that controls your eyes, and it's making your eyes try to find something to look at to maintain balance. Okay, so your cerebellum is heavily involved in your vestibular sense, or your sense of balance. The next area I want to emphasize is this shaft right here, this bluish shaft right here at the bottom. Now that's your medulla. That is the part of your brain responsible for maintaining certain vital signs like your heart rate and respiration. If the medulla goes down, so does your heart rate and so does your breathing. And in fact, if the medulla goes down, if it's destroyed for whatever reason, the only way you can survive is on a machine. You will be brain dead if the medulla is dead. Okay? So that's your midbrain. Sorry, that's your hindbrain. Your midbrain is comprised of a number of structures that, well, several of them actually have colors in their name, and I think that's hilarious. I don't know why. I'm easily amused. Anyway, I'm only going to mention a couple. First is the substantia nigra. Let me see if, here we go. So here is a section or a sliver of your midbrain that's been cut out here. So these dark slots right here are your substantia nigra. Now your substantia nigra, and you can see where that is cut from. See that white line there? That's where this is cut from. The substantia nigra is involved in movement. Specifically, it provides your brain with dopamine that it then uses to move. For example, in Parkinson's, people with Parkinson's disease who have tremors and movement disorders, they actually have degenerated cells in their substantia nigra, so that their substantia nigra actually produces less dopamine. So with less dopamine, your brain is less able to produce coherent, stable movement. The other area that I like to point out, just because I think fear peeing is hilarious, is the periaqueductal gray. Okay, and this area is in general involved in fear response. But one of my favorite, and response to external stressors of all manner, but my favorite response is the fear peeing. So in shows, or I'm sure you've even experienced it in life, maybe not necessarily yourself. I have dogs who one specifically likes to do it all the time. No, doesn't like to. It's an automatic response. But anyway, when they're afraid, they pee. That's the periaqueductal gray. The periaqueductal gray is responsible for that. That is your midbrain. Now let's move on to the forebrain. And there's a lot of stuff in your forebrain. I mean, if you remember, the forebrain is a big area. So in general, we can talk about subcortical and cortical areas. When I say cortical, I mean the cerebral cortex. All right. So if you see here, all these convolutions, when you think of a brain, that convoluted part. Sorry, this right here. So all of this right here, all these wrinkly parts. See, that's your cerebellum. But all these wrinkly parts, this is all your cerebral cortex. Now we take it apart. Then in here, we can see subcortical structures, but these subcortical structures are still part of the forebrain. Okay. Now, let's start talking about those subcortical structures. There's a couple that I want to highlight. First, we have the thalamus. You see those yellow almond-shaped things? That is your thalamus. Now, it looks like there's two, and because the reason that is because technically your brain is just two mirror images of each other. That's why this brain comes apart. Okay, so each of these pieces, these two parts, are basically a brain of themselves. And if they weren't connected, they can actually act like two separate brains. So technically you have two thalamuses. Technically you have two hippocampuses and everything else that I'm about to talk about. But most of the time, in a normal functioning brain that has connections between the two act as one, or they work together. So the reason I want to point out the thalamus is because the thalamus is the sensory relay of the brain. So the vast majority of your sensory input comes from your eyes, from your mouth, from your nose, from your ears, from your skin. All of that, almost all of it, is routed through all of those things that I mentioned, except for your nose, is routed through your thalamus. Okay? The nose actually goes directly to the olfactory cortex. It doesn't have to go to the thalamus. Everything else, though, has to go through the thalamus. So all of that information goes to the thalamus, and the thalamus sends it out to the appropriate area in the cerebral cortex where it needs to go. The other area that I wanted to mention is the hypothalamus. Now, this is going to be hard to see here, but you see the two almond-shaped thalamuses. Right there in the middle, you see a little bump. See that? See where this arrow is going to here? That little bump is called the hypothalamus. Now, the reason I point out the hypothalamus is because the hypothalamus controls, to a large extent, your endocrine system. So your endocrine system is a system of glands throughout your body that secrete chemicals called hormones. And these hormones, they change the way different tissues of your body work or react or act. And your hypothalamus controls, to a large extent, that endocrine system. So when you have a rush of adrenaline, okay, well, your adrenal glands are actually in your kidneys, not in your brain. But your hypothalamus can release what are called topical hormones, which then get released through your body, which trigger the glands in your body to release their own hormones. Okay, so trigger your adrenal glands on your kidneys to release adrenaline. Okay. The other area that I want to point out is the hippocampus. So on this picture, it's this purple circular item here. Okay, that is your hippocampus. Now, the reason I want to point out your hippocampus is because the hippocampus is one of the major areas in your brain involved in memory. So if something were to happen to your hippocampus, you would experience some kind of memory deficit. So people who experience amnesia, both antero or retrograde amnesia from head injury, they experience that because of some kind of damage to one of a number of structures, one of those being the hippocampus. Now I know I just threw out there antero and retrograde amnesia, so really quickly I'll tell you what those two are. Retrograde amnesia is a loss of memories that you've already created. So you forget things that have happened to you in the past. Anterograde amnesia is an inability to create new memories. So think 50 First Dates. You know how the girl could never remember the same day. She forgot the day over and over and over again. She had anterograde amnesia. Now, real anterograde amnesia wouldn't allow her to remember the whole day. It's even sadder than that. You may not be able to remember anything more than a couple minutes. But that's anterograde amnesia. Okay? So we've talked about the hippocampus, we've talked about the hypothalamus, we've talked about the thalamus. Okay? Now let's move out to the cerebral cortex. Now the cerebral cortex is all sorts of convoluted. You can see it's got all these wrinkles. Now, the wrinkles and the folds have different names. So all of these wrinkles here, so this, these are all called gyri, and all the folds are called sulci. A single fold would be called a sulcus. Now, some of these folds are deeper than others, like this one down the middle. Deeper sulci are referred to as fissures. So a fissure is just a deep sulcus. Okay? So now if we look at the cerebral cortex, okay, we have a couple fissures and a couple sulci that kind of mark different areas. Okay? So although it's not really here very well, you can see an indentation right here and an indentation right here. Well, scientists draw an imaginary line from here all the way over to here. That then, specifically right here and right here, is called the central sulcus, and this is what divides the frontal cortex right here, and in this picture you can see it colored. It's the blue area. Okay? Divides the frontal cortex from the rest of the brain. So what does the frontal cortex do? The frontal cortex is primarily responsible for planning and executive function. So when you make a decision to study or to eat or to not study or to whatever, you are using the executive function. You are using your executive function, and you're doing that in your frontal cortex. The frontal cortex is also responsible for, as I said, planning and reasoning. So when you're really thinking about a problem, that's your frontal cortex. Now, that central sulcus divides the frontal cortex from the parietal cortex, which is up here on the top. Back here, there's also there's a sulcus right here, and it goes around and it continues over here. But then again, scientists continue the line up. Now, the section between here and here, but on top, yeah, I can't do that. So I'll show you the colored picture. So you see this top piece, the purple, and then here on the side, that's called your parietal cortex. Now your parietal cortex is heavily involved in touch sensation and visual spatial processing. In fact, there's a small area right here towards the front of your parietal cortex. Now remember how I called this divide right here the central sulcus? This tissue at the front of your parietal cortex is called the postcentral gyrus, or the somatosensory cortex. This somatosensory cortex is involved in tactile perception. So you have an area all along here, devoted to every part of your body. Everywhere that you can touch and feel something, has an input to the somatosensory cortex, and this is the part of your brain that processes that touch. Now, on the front end of that central sulcus, in the frontal cortex, you have the motor cortex. So this is right here in the blue area, the back part of the frontal cortex, right here. That's the motor cortex, and it has a connection to every part of the body that you can control. So me flailing my arms around, I'm able to do that because connections from the motor cortex that control my hands and arms are receiving signals from the areas of my motor cortex that control my hands and arms. All right. Now, behind this line, which I didn't mention its name, it's called the parietal occipital fissure. All right. The area behind it, on the back here, and here, basically the back end of your brain. That's called your occipital cortex, or your visual cortex. Occipital cortex is the appropriate name for it. But the occipital cortex primarily processes vision. And yeah, it's on the back of your head. So here's my brain, right? And it's oriented in the same way. So the occipital cortex is actually in the back of my head. I know that seems a little weird because your eyes are in the front, but their signal actually goes all the way to the back of your head. First through the thalamus, and then onto the occipital cortex. Now, you see the purple area here? Okay? That's actually divided by another deep fold called the lateral fissure that travels along the side here, on both sides. That separates this pinkish area, or orangish area, from all the other lobes, or at least from the frontal and the parietal occipital fissure separates the occipital cortex from the temporal. Now, the temporal cortex is involved in hearing and memory. So, your ability to hear things, the primary auditory cortex, that's in your temporal lobe. Your ability to recognize faces, your memory for faces, is in an area called the fusiform facial area, which is in your temporal lobe, specifically in your right temporal lobe. All right? So those are the major areas of the cortex that I wanted to mention. As before, if you have any questions, be sure to ask. Otherwise, take it easy.